Welcome, Alexander Bard. Thank you for chatting with me. We've known each other for a little over 4 years since I came onto the Meta Modern list, and we butted heads.
Thank you for having me, Brent. So we should
Yeah,
say to all
likewise.
those who don't know where we are that, Brent, you're located in Vancouver, Canada at the moment, and I'm located in Stockholm, Sweden. So this is a transatlantic call, or way more than that even.
Mhm. And across the political divide. So
I don't know about that, actually.
well, we're gonna find out.
Yes, yes, exactly. This is like, it's a riddle. The Bard versus Cooper relationship, and I'm thrilled. And why don't you start, Brent? Why don't you tell the people who listen to this webcast who you are and what you're up to?
Sure. I thought it'd be fun to introduce each other too, because you know, you're always eccentric in that way, and you know, one thing I've been trying to do is, you know, pull different worlds together. So lots of people in my political circles would have no idea who you are, but you're a Swedish philosopher. You've written a number of successful books, and you're a pop star, and you know those things go hand in hand, obviously.
Formerly pop star, I should say. Yeah.
Formerly, yeah.
I'm at the age where I prefer cigar and cognac over being on a stage. So
sounds good.
Yeah.
But
no, but I started in the music industry, and I was 23 or something when I had my big break as a record producer and a songwriter, and that includes North America certainly as well in the 1990s. But then I resigned from that 7 years ago, and I already picked up a second career as a philosopher, which I think you have a talent for, which is why you and I got engaged several years ago. Because you're one of these whiz kids who can certainly express yourself in the text, you know, and you certainly can think. So I've written 5 books so far, and I'm working on a 6th book, and I'm writing my books together with a co-philosopher called Jan Söderqvist, because we love to write together. So you can think of Bard and Söderqvist as maybe by now the sort of Scandinavian Deleuze and Guattari or something like that, but I think we're on a par with that. So that's what we do. And we work from Europe, and we travel the world. I often come to North America. I increasingly see how people are leaving California and moving to places like Canada, certainly to Canada. But I also travel a lot the rest of the world, that I've spent a lot of time, for example, in India and Russia in my career. So that's the summary. How about you, Brent?
I've backpacked a bit, but these days I stay planted, you know, economically and pandemically. It's not very wise to travel, and environmentally, and so I'm a bit of a hermit. You know, I think that's an important phase for a philosopher to go through, and also an aspiring musician. And when we met, you encouraged me not to pursue that at all. Looking out for me, of course, right? But I think it's actually, it's, you know, what pops into my head is there are other musician sort of philosophers that come to mind, people I respect, like Frank Zappa, you know.
Oh, art and philosophy go together, because philosophy
Yeah,
is an art form. It's not a science. So,
and I guess political activism too is what I'm getting at.
Oh yeah, I agree completely. So philosophy, we should say, is a verbal it later became. It started as a verbal and eventually became a literary art form. So a philosopher is kind of, you know, the opposite of the poet, where the poet tries to expand the world by adding more words to it, and the philosopher tries to nail the world, and, you know, tries to use language to nail and understand the human condition. I would say that is fundamentally what philosophy is. So philosophy is in itself an art form, and of course philosophers are art critics, and they work with art theory, and it's kind of, you're absolutely right. Not only do philosophers deal with art, I think they must deal with politics. I think you can't really think of yourself as a philosopher unless you're some kind of a public intellectual or an activist. So you do get engaged in the time in which you live. I think there's a requirement to call yourself a philosopher to go.
People give artists, actors, musicians a hard time for having a political opinion, but I think if they're right, then it doesn't matter that they're famous. You know, you should listen to them. I think it's great when people like that use their platform to advocate. You know, Rage Against the Machine is another example. They're just very political, very thoughtful in what they do.
Yeah, I would argue that actually you should have a political opinion. If you try not to have one, you're a cynical whore.
Mhm.
Just tries to sell records or sell streams these days. So I wouldn't mind at all. But of course, you got to watch out as well, because sometimes it looks like your activism is a compensation for the fact you're not very talented or didn't work very hard on the music. And that's why I think it's important to critically have the perspective that you're perfectly fine to criticize an artist for their political opinions, but you can also appreciate that they make fantastic music, or the other way around. You can appreciate somebody for having a political opinion and using the platform that actually fame and celebrity status can give them. But on the other hand, you can also say they make crappy records. So you can separate
Yeah.
the two.
Yeah. So I think you're a great philosopher and your music is good. It's not my tastes, but it's skillful. But I think your political opinions are the opposite. I think they're shit. And we've butted heads over things like Bernie Sanders and basic things. And what I realize in, reviewing the exchanges, and that there's just a lot of claims. For example, like you can have a slew of reasons to not support Bernie Sanders, but like your answer was, you're an economist and his budgeting doesn't, add up. And my rebuttal was, well, he's on the, Senate Budget Committee, and he's lifelong kind of fiscally responsible person, and maybe we're actually not looking into the details of it sufficiently to make those judgments. Because I think, politically, the Bernie Sanders movement and coalition was the way forward, and it was just up against, virtually insurmountable opposition, from the mainstream media and the establishment, and it doesn't help when intellectuals can't solve the problem either. They bicker over it, they take sides, and it just becomes very petty and partisan. And like our original metamodern list kind of split, and we all had a falling out over issues like this, and issues like Jordan Peterson, like what is his status and his rank as an intellectual and a social critic. And I wanted to resolve those issues.
Yeah,
but
I do
I but
too.
I
Yeah.
but I feel like, yeah, and we've come back together eventually. I feel like your intellectual deep web list is still quite reactionary, and we can unpack what that means. But just for example, like as a philosopher, you're capable of having a nuanced view, but you also like hot takes. You'll have a hot take on Black Lives Matter, or you want Candace Owens to be president, or whatever. It's maybe tongue in cheek, but if we were to actually, dissect it and unpack it and engage it, I think we come up with different ways to talk about those things.
Yeah, I think the one to start with is to try to eliminate these terms progressive and reactionary. Because actually, to begin with, if you use those terms, you take it from an American perspective. And hey, I'm not American. And we're going to have a conversation between you as a Canadian and I'm a Scandinavian. So we don't actually have to buy into the American discourse to begin with. I think it's just liberating in the sense that we can go to the actual arguments. So, for example, I'm a Marxist, but I'm not a socialist. And the reason for that is that Marxism succeeded in the sense that it became social democracy in Europe. And I think social democracy did a fantastic job between the mid 1800s and the mid 1900s in actually guiding the working class forward, making it powerful, giving the working class negotiating power. And I think, for example, the Germanic and the Scandinavian models for social democracy after 1945 were highly successful, undoubtedly so. But by the time when you came to the 1980s, at least here in Europe, the West started ignoring Karl Marx. They found Karl Marx to be too complicated, and they started despising the worker. And I think actually Bernie Sanders is a good voice in the sense that he's actually pro the worker. Actually, ironically, so was Donald Trump. So what happened was that people stopped making a proper class analysis of society. And in 1985, a very important book came along here in Europe, authored by Chantal Mouffe, who's a very clever Belgian female professor. and her friend Ernesto Laclau, who was an Argentinian professor. And they wrote a philosophy book, which of course is very well written, so it should be taken seriously, called Hedge Money, a socialist strategy. And what they laid out was essentially a sort of strategy built on Rousseau rather than Marx, where they tried to eliminate the worker and class analysis and basically put forward all kinds of other identities that should be fought for. And as we all know, this became what I'm very critical of, which I call woke culture. And most Marxists are very critical of woke culture. So, for example, Slavoj Žižek as well, simply because we think class analysis beats the shit out of all other analysis out there. I think at the end of the day, it's who's got the power in a given society. At least 100 years ago was definitely the person who had the most money. 300 years before that was whoever was closest to the courts and owned the most land. And I think today, this is very much about who's got the power over digital. And this is why the first book I wrote with Jan Söderqvist 20 years ago, The Netocrats. The Netocrats is a Marxist class analysis taking digital seriously. So we're saying that in addition to just thinking about money, like Thomas Piketty and these guys do still, we have to actually start discussing a digital class analysis. We formulated an upper class that we call netocrats. It's Kevin Kelly's term. And then we said we're also going to have a consumptariat when digital hits us really hard in, say, the next 20 to 30 years, which is about where we're at right now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important to stress that I'm a Marxist. And I think Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and the American left are great when they defend the worker and the workers' rights. And sometimes actually Donald Trump stole that agenda from them and seemed to be more credible to some workers, to his credit. And I found that very interesting because I think identity politics was doomed because when the left started to play the identity politics card, they needed an abject to unify around. Because if you're going to take tons of different groups of people and unify them around something, the only way to do that is either put a savior at the front or to put somebody to blame. And they took the white heterosexual man and then blamed it on some mysterious ghost called patriarchy. And this was like the theory we've had since the 1980s. And I think it's gone completely, it's been derailed by now, right? So I take my cue from African immigrants in North America. And African immigrants are coming to North America not very impressed with Black Lives Matter. They think it's a white middle class thing. They just want to do what's right, and they want to send their kids to the best schools, and they want to work hard, and they get irritated when they don't get that opportunity. And that is genuine racism. When somebody, because they got a black skin color, is prevented from achieving something, right? But they're heroic in their approach. But they're heroic.
African immigrants like Obama, right? According to Trump, he was born in Kenya. He's an African immigrant.
But partly, yes. And remember this one thing.
No,
America's not elected president yet who had slave ancestry. They haven't. That's going to be radical different compared to picking a guy like Barack Obama. He was more like a savior to Black Americans, like he was not part of them. And he had an African and a white American upbringing in Hawaii. He was born into the upper classes like a courtly prince or something. Nothing wrong with that. I think Barack Obama was very important to the overall narrative. But I want to stress that I'm a leftist in the sense that I'm a Marxist, that I believe in proper class analysis, the only way to put forward proper arguments that actually have value and substance.
Yeah.
And I think identity politics has lost that completely because identity politics become about who gets the attention and not about actually who has the power.
Yeah. So I grok all that. I feel that the people, like, first of all, the left makes those critiques, right? There's a home for you on the left. Jacobin does Marxist analysis. That's their brand. You know, love it or hate it. There's lots of that going on all the time. And so in terms of your values, you know, you're claiming to the left, but in terms of your speech acts, your affiliations, who you sort of support online, I'd say it's reactionary, and it's reacting to, like, for example, when you say these theories of the patriarchy, like I don't think the left or the Bernie messaging was necessarily leading with those types of arguments, but that's what was interpreted on the right. So the right was reacting.
But wait a second. You accused me of using speech acts that would have put me somewhere politically. I think
Yeah.
that's just banal. I think attacking somebody because of the tonality or their etiquette is incredibly bourgeois. It is very Versailles. It's not the streets of Paris.
Yeah,
It's
I
not
agree. I mean,
revolutionary.
this is what
And
I
yeah,
like about you too, is that I think of you as like the bard of bombast, and you're you put up a good fight, and like you and like Jim Rutt, we can argue and not really offend each other. You can call me whatever you want. I'm not going to tone police you, but
mm.
I'm trying to sort of map the context here and encourage you and others to like think about the effects of who you support. And so just not
Yeah, but
to
wait. I'm not an
yeah,
American, Brent. I'm
I know.
European.
No,
I
but
live in Scandinavia.
we're all
Yeah.
global, right?
No,
This
no,
is
but we have different things here, and I'm Hegelian in a deep sense, meaning that I
mhm.
probably go with the right when I think the right is what a society needs, and I'm free to go with the left when that's what I think a society needs. And when it
Yeah.
comes to Scandinavia, with Bernie Sanders has used Sweden as a perfect example in his policies. Apparently, dreams about Sweden. Yes, Sweden is a fantastic country. There's tons of stuff to learn from Sweden. I'm sure about that. But Sweden has its own problems, and the problems over here, which we write about in the book Digital Libido,
Mhm.
is that we infantilize society, got everybody used to a great tit called the welfare state. And that has become deeply problematic, especially when Sweden is encountered with the outside world. And we've got a lot of tons of immigrants into the country, and these policies fail. We're much worse than America or Canada at absorbing immigrants, apparently in Sweden. We have major problems with this right now, probably because you mimic you guys without finding out actually how it works. So I would say that here in Europe is a different agenda than the one in America. And I would gladly probably vote with the left if I lived in North America, but I would probably today vote with the right if I live in Western Europe, simply because the conditions in these two places are very different at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on European politics, but I think there's common trends to the right populist aesthetic and the policies that they support. And so, given that you're an intellectual, what I find troubling is that I just want to name some names of people you've tweeted, right? And this isn't representative of all your tweets, but like this is just what I saw scrolling. Thomas Sowell, Candace Owens, Ryan Fournier, who's a Trump students guy, Ded Browning, who's a mega pro-lifer, Barry Weiss, and Meghan McCain. Now, from the left perspective, these people, you know, are not really intellectuals. They don't really engage the left on its own arguments. I mean, Thomas Sowell is
Oh,
an
Thomas Sowell
academic.
is
He's an
an
academic.
intellectual.
He's an
Brent,
academic. He's legendary to
no,
some
no, no.
camps. I think he has a
He's a
controversial.
major American intellectual, for God's sake. I mean, I
Well,
can agree with leftists too. I don't have to agree with a person's opinions
yeah.
to actually
Look,
acknowledge the fact that they're a major intellectual. If somebody disagrees with me, I don't try to belittle them the first thing I do. I think that's really dangerous. Thomas Sowell has enormous credentials, and he's been fantastic. And he's also like you and me. He hasn't been afraid to speak his truth, and he's done that for decades. I think Thomas Sowell is really valuable to overall discourse in North America, and I do think he's a proper intellectual. Yes. If I quote people when I tweet, doesn't mean that I endorse everything they say. I just think they're worthy of reading, and I
right,
do consciously read people I disagree with to
right.
expand my own mind. Right.
Yeah, in some cases there are endorsements, but we don't need to get into the specifics. I mean, the thing with Sowell, I want to respect him as an academic, right? He's published a lot of books and so on, right? So he's earned that sort of attention. But the speaking circuit that he goes on, Dave Rubin and all this is just totally pandering to the far right. It's not true intellectual engagement that people want to see.
Who are you to judge that? What makes you the judge of that? You're starting deplatforming people right here.
No, I'm not.
This
No,
is
no,
what
no,
deplatforming culture is, Brent.
not at all.
You're trying to belittle them by no, you're making
No.
people guilty by association without even meeting their arguments. Thomas Sowell and Dave Ruby did not agree on tons of shit. Okay, so they're in the same place. I debate with nationalists over here in Europe. I debate with communists over here in Europe. I debate with anybody who likes to take a debate with me as long as they respect me when I go into discourse. Okay, I think that's the fair thing to do. It doesn't mean that I'm them. It doesn't mean if I sit next to somebody that I endorse what they think. It's just that I endorse the dialogue with them. That's
Yeah.
radically different. And I think what is sickening today is this whole thing of guilty by association, because guilty by association is only the precursor to deplatforming, cancel culture, and the
Yeah.
fucking mess that woke people are causing in America from both sides. So this is actually what alt-right people are doing. This is what the alt-left is doing. And God, I'm tired and sick of both of them, right? Can we get to proper arguments? And that means that when two people are having a conversation, it means that the idea expressed from any of them is in the air for anybody to own and do as they please with. And you can go off from that conversation, make up your own mind, which you do temporarily anyway. You're, of course, willing to change your mind at any given time. So you take a temporary position after you've had a discourse with somebody. So I don't think to belittling Dave Rubin's
Yeah.
show or something like that. Then he
It,
can meet you with the same arguments that Brent Cooper is talking to on the bar.
it's not guilt by association, and it's not belittling these people without engaging their arguments. Like basically what I'm saying is like from the left, all of their arguments have been engaged with. I've seen Thomas Sowell effectively debunked. I've read published journal articles that critique him, and what I see from him is a very circular logic and saying the same things. And there's some truth. If there's a nugget of truth to what he's saying, it becomes distorted by his own rhetoric. And I think that's the case for you as well. I'm not at all making a guilt by association argument, because I think people should talk
Oh,
to
you
each other, but it's
you
how
did.
they
I'm
associate.
glad you don't want to do that, so we can
Like,
get that out of the
yeah,
way. You said
yeah.
he's in the wrong circuit. He's hanging out with the wrong people. You know
No,
what?
he's not
You know,
engaging the left.
you
He's
know what?
not engaging the left at
I do
all.
not
Show me
believe
an
in.
interview where Thomas Sowell is, with respect or in any case engaged a proper leftist. I haven't seen
Why
it.
would he? Why would he have to? They spit at him. So
Exactly.
why would he? Why would he? Because they spit at
He
him.
assumes
Right?
a role as a public intellectual. So, I mean,
It doesn't mean you have to talk to leftists to spit at him. If somebody
no, no,
spits
no.
at me, I leave
He,
the room.
yeah, but he is criticizing them first, right? He's shitting on them, he's spitting on them, and then he says, well, I don't have to engage with that. And
No,
so
he's not spitting on them. He's
the
engaging in
trend
arguments, and they can meet the arguments.
the trend, I mean, so this is part of the kind of pattern of the intellectual dark web too. It became this sort of conglomeration, that was a provisional alignment in 2017. And what I saw happening in every pocket, uh, every fan club for these different folks, and every channel, was attempts to engage were not received. It became a bubble very quickly that was
I agree.
next to impossible to penetrate, and so it was hypocritical on its own terms. And I made this argument early on, and then I saw tons of other leftists start to make similar arguments and have different ways in to critique the whole enterprise. Meanwhile, we still want to get through to them. Like, we still want to break the impasse. And it's very hard to do, and that's why I like engaging with you, but it's a case in point, because there's issues where if we disagree, we bounce off each other instead of going into it. And so I want to help both of us, keep reframing our arguments in more positive terms, right? So your approach.
Well, I'm not a part of the intellectual dark web. Let's start there, right? They have a really weird, sick idea of Karl Marx to begin with. They haven't even read him or whatever. I don't know.
Right.
I think though several of them are great intellectuals, and I appreciate Eric Weinstein's work. I think he's very clever, and he's always worth it to listen to. Jordan Peterson's been off the hook for the last 3 years for health reasons and stuff, and I think he was important as an activist, but as far as philosophy is concerned, he's a pop guy. He's basically an art historian and a cognitive scientist. And he's pretty good at that. And he got some guys to wake up in the morning and start making their beds. That's not too bad. But, I don't read Jordan Peterson to quote him all over the place in my next book. I do proper philosophy. So I read Karl Marx, and I certainly read Nietzsche, and I read Hegel, and I read Whitehead. these are masterminds. These are geniuses. But I think what's important here in the debate overall to me, and where I take my values from, regardless of whether it's left or right, is that I want to stay in a mode that I call heroic mode. And heroic mode means that we all know that if you turn yourself into a victim and start practicing some kind of a victimhood cult around yourself, you actually, more than anything, become your own enemy. And you just start making these sort of eternal accusations against people to compensate for something you've lost, right? And they could be warranted, right? But you keep doing that and you never get out of it. So you're going to foster your children to be the same way. I give an example. It was in India, I learned this about 20 years ago, because there was somebody begging in the street. And it's kind of a natural reaction. I'm a Scandinavian. I come from an affluent world with, smallest Gini coefficient in the world, where you take care of our poor. And I was ready to throw some money over to that poor person who was sitting there begging. And this Indian lady walked next to me. She just told me to fuck off. It's just like, don't do that, because if you give money to a beggar, the beggar will go home and cut his arms off his child, or will take out the eyes of the child. That's how poor these people are. If you're serious about your commitment that you don't want beggars in the streets of India, you do as we do. She was a Zoroastrian. You do as we do. You go home and you put the money together on a bank account. You provide it to somebody who builds a school for children, especially a school for these beggars' children, because so the beggars' children can go to school and live a better life than being beggars, right? If you're serious. Okay, so the posturing today and the virtue signaling is very much about throwing money to the beggar and posing with it, rather than looking at systemic faults with society as a whole. And I don't care if you call it left or right. I'm interested in any ideology out there that uses digital technology today and takes these issues seriously and looks at the injustices of the world as it is right now and try to enable more people out there to come into the heroic mode and stay there. And this is why I don't believe in authority. I don't believe in quoting who gave a credit to what. I don't care about academic titles, because to me, most of the cases when I travel around the world, it's usually a working class mom who's the smartest person around when it comes to what people actually need. And working class moms tend to be in the heroic mode. They tend to want the kids to get up in the morning and go to school and do better than she did and the kid's dad did. And that's why I share Camille Pagla's sentiment, and I share Karl Marx's sentiment, that I love people who want to do what's right for themselves and their own families. And I don't care if that's left or right. It's just heroic. So what I'm opposed to with the alt-right, and what I'm opposed to with the alt-left today, is that these identitarians have gone into victimhood cults that I find incredibly destructive, and they're of no help to the people who are involved with them either. And then these victimhood cults are kidnapped by middle-class people who already are affluent and have tons of money as a way of posing with their virtues.
Yeah, you mean it's captured.
It's captured.
Yeah.
And this, what Marxists always criticize, when they say that it's typical for the upper class to have charity events.
Oh, yeah.
So the upper class is charity events. And please note, the poor people and the beggars are never welcome to the charity events. They pretend that the charity events are for the beggars and for the poor people out there, and take a little money of all the affluence they have, a small part of it, and pretend to give it away to something to pose.
Yeah.
And this is where today's victimhood cults end up when they come in contact with social media. They're kidnapped, hijacked by academic middle-class people who use these cults to pose and virtue signal, and that's not doing any good for anybody.
How can you tell the difference between somebody who's just self-victimizing and somebody who's actually a victim?
Because of temporality. So say you've been hit by a car in a car accident. You are a victim. You clearly are the victim. And probably if the driver was drunk, or he saw you and drove anyway and hit you, or he was driving too fast, then he needs far more than a speed ticket for actually having hit you and maybe destroy your life. You are a victim in that case, but you're temporarily a victim. To then go home and make yourself a victim forever, or say that you were born a victim and there's no way for you to rise above, is what I call victimhood cults. And that's the kind of victimhood I'm talking about.
So, given that example, though, I don't think that sort of thing actually exists, where someone's hit by a car and then they're bitter about cars for the rest of their life, or whatever it is. Like, we're talking about more distant effects of things like systemic racism and not so obviously causal mechanisms like, oh, you're hit by a car, or oh, somebody assaulted you or stole from you. There's ways, and I'm not just talking about some vague, abstract, invisible oppression, but in the Marxist sense, economic inequality and the way society subsequently is stratified can be oppressive, and there can,
Yeah. But
I
is
don't
that at the end of the day, anybody can make money if they have a healthy surroundings and they get the right education and get a
see
chance in
that
life.
is a premise that is a bridge too far. I think that's
No,
not
it's
true. I
not at
mean,
all. Any
no,
any any immigrant population that's arrived in North America the last 100 years has been successful. Every single one of them. Even the Somalis today get jobs everywhere, work hard and educate themselves and make their own money. So at the end of the day, that's the goal of a Marxist. The goal of a Marxist is not to send taxes off to the state and let the state repay you, because it just creates a strong state. It doesn't create a strong proletariat. And Marx's point is to have a strong proletariat of proud people who work hard and make money and run their own shit. It's
yeah.
not about having a strong
So
state.
as
So
as
socialism was not the goal of Marxism. At best, it was temporary, like social democracy. The goal was always to make the state small and have a strong proletariat. Now, that, for example, means that my critique of Black Lives Matter is that this is not about raising statues of old drug addicts that were killed by the police. This is about stopping the war on drugs. The war on drugs is the single most hurtful. It's the third world war.
that's what
It
I've been
really,
saying for years.
yeah, you and I agree. It destroys Latin America
Yeah.
and it's destroyed Black American life, because it obviously puts a lot of Black American men in jail who shouldn't be in jail to begin with, because if you trade drugs, it's just like any other commodity you trade in a
Yeah.
capitalist society. So why should we be punished for it? And after all, it's white kids who buy all the drugs, so most of them anyway. The hypocrisy in the United States is enormous. And if anything is systemically racist and should be attacked today, the number one priority is
Yeah.
get rid of the war on drugs. Now, if that was top of the agenda for Black Lives Matter, I'd be part of it. But I didn't see that. I didn't
Yeah.
see that
I
happening at
think
all. It's
the
all about police
messaging
brutality.
the messaging gets lost. I mean, police brutality is a serious issue, but it's like, with the Occupy movement, there was good messaging, but it gets lost and diluted as it proliferates. It's tragic in a sense, because it's not that there's not good messaging. I mean, to actually engage with some of the activists involved in BLM, to follow them, to listen to what they're saying patiently, it takes a lot more effort than these sort of more quick knee-jerk reactions, which you're responding to some effect, but it's like we're all, and I try not to do this, but it's like we're all responding to the cultural discourse, not the leaders in these movements, and not, we're not steel manning the arguments when that's what, as you just did with the war on drugs. Like, that is my preferred argument. And when Joe Biden says he's not going to legalize marijuana, but he'll say that Black Lives Matter or whatever, it's like talking out of the side of your mouth. And
Yes.
so what I want to do though is genuinely get you and others to sort of commit, even if it's tentative, to being on the left in a more helpful way, because in both elections, Bernie came very close to a tipping point. And what I found in those scenarios and all throughout is just the critics of Bernie Sanders weren't really interested in engaging. Like, I invoke Jim Rudd again, because I'm going on his podcast in a couple weeks, and I clashed.
I'll be there too in November, so we're both going to talk to Jim.
Great. I clashed
It's
with
great
him.
that you did first. Yeah.
Yeah, with him and the whole Game B kind of discourse and the ideology going on there, because it was so kind of controlled. Like, this is the way we do things, and it was sort of hyper pluralist in the sense that they encouraged reactionaries to participate, and it was like consciously wanted to like block out critical race theory discourse. That was like an explicit thing. And this is like 6 months before what happened in the debates last week with Trump saying, oh, critical race theory are the real racists. kind of thing. And like, it's just at this point, it's beyond farce, because, you know, the actual texts of sociology and critical race theory and critical theory are never that simplified, you know. And as you say about people like Peterson, like they just don't read Marx. They don't even know what critical theory is. Their starting point is literally a straw man.
But what do you mean with critical race theory when you use the term here? Do you use an ideology, or is it a theoretical field? Because that's a big difference.
Yeah, theoretical field. Like I think of it in the broadest sense, like referring to hundreds of books, many of which I'm aware of, but haven't even read, right? But just something like Black Marxism by Cedric Robinson, you know, or anything by W.E.B. Du Bois. Like this is the Black tradition of sociology that precedes the more contemporary discourse. And so fast forward, I'll say a point about the whole white fragility thing, because I agree to some extent that Robin DiAngelo's kind of writing on the topic and her methods of, you know, teaching it and engaging on it is counterproductive. But it doesn't mean white fragility isn't a real phenomenon. I think historically that's something we all have to grapple with, like these abstract ideas like patriarchy and like white supremacy that we come into contact with in our lives, in our generation, that have these historical echoes and repercussions. So, you know, with Trump being against critical race theory, it's completely upside down. Like what we need is just better public education. And before I forget, maybe I wanted to touch on the point of, you know, the poor person, you shouldn't throw him money. I agree with that sentiment, but you know, then you're saying you're against the Swedish welfare state because it went too far.
Yeah.
Right. And I get the idea of it going too far, but in the States, they barely even have a welfare state. You know, in Canada, I'm dependent on the welfare state right now because of my health. Right. And I want that to extend to everybody as well. Right. People, you know, like me, beyond identity, because this is a category that has nothing to do with my whiteness or my maleness. But so, you know, globally, every country, and there needs to be some sort of global safety net. We need to find the right balance.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I think we cut out for a second there. Sorry.
Yeah. We're back in?
Yeah.
Stable? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't know what was cut off there and what I was saying, but I'm just saying we need some sort of welfare state for that homeless person, right? Because your proposed solution was, you know, donate to, you know, an organization that's building schools, and that's a bit of a libertarian idea, right, within Marxism, as you, that's kind of what you identify with, right? And I would just say, you know, we need to reel back all these sort of convictions and actually build, you know, especially in the United States, it's sort of a nexus for foreign policy and how the world and how the United Nations is governed. But there needs to be a consistent baseline for people that is totally depoliticized, and that
but I think if he just stays in a sort of critical theory mode in academics, it's not going to do much help, because all it can do, it can just moan and bitch, right, all the time. And at the end of the day, you need new visions. You need a proper vision. I don't mean Barack Obama's "I'm going to make change," right? Or Donald Trump's "I'm going to make America great again." We all knew what that was. But, you know, we need proper vision here. And I agree. I think Joe Biden, there's nothing there. It's just, yeah, he's playing a power game and he wants to be the president of the United States. What does he want? Well, what is the vision here? Yeah, he's got some environmentalist policies and tries to play that card. When it comes to anything dramatically, where he actually would be the slightest bit controversial, like, for example, legalizing marijuana, then he's not even on it. It's like, who does he want to win? It's, I want visions. And in that sense, even guys who come along and say, we want a separate state for Black people, and we believe race is actually real, and we want a Black America somewhere, and take 2 provinces or states away from the United States, that's at least some kind of a vision, to be honest about it, that you can respect, because you can take it intellectually seriously. It sounds weird, but actually you can. Why would the United States staying together be sacred? I mean, I think Brexit is healthy for the European Union. I would love if one of the 50 states of the United States says, no, 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 we're going to leave. We'll go off on our own and do our own thing. I think it would be healthy for the United States if that happened. Um, and, you know, if some people believe that for all I care, I think eye color, skin color, hair color, I could not care less. My philosophy is completely colorblind. And the sooner we get over it, the better. And I think what happened, what we mistake for race is actually the discourse of certain cultures occupying certain cultures, at least for a time, and plundering it, which was called rape and pillage back in the days, that had very little to do with race. And slavery, by the way, it's universal. It's called work these days. And work is usually when you're a slave for 8 hours a day rather than 24 hours a day, because they won't even pay you for 24 hours a day. That's a typically Marxist attitude towards work and slavery. So at the end of the day, yeah, I think race is completely overrated, to be honest about it, and an American obsession that the rest of the world is sick with. Yes, people do look at you when you walk into the room. They might misjudge you because of your skin color, but you could also be fat and ugly, or you're beautiful and young and sexy or whatever. Yeah, people have opinions about you. It doesn't necessarily mean that that's your value. That's just their opinions. And people are allowed to have any opinion they like about Brent and about Alexander. They're actually allowed to have that. And they don't have to go to bed with you because you want to sleep with them. Because we're probably getting there eventually, woke culture, that fat and ugly people will force themselves on beautiful people. Because at the end of the day, the most unfair thing in the world is that some people are sexy and some people are not. So if you can't live with those things, you can't be a Marxist. You're some kind of an absurd Rousseauian, obsessed with equality of outcome rather than with equality of opportunity. And Marxists and liberals and conservatives, at least what liberals and conservatives are at their better selves, agree on this one thing, that equality of opportunity might not be a bad idea. It could be worked towards. It could actually benefit everybody in society. So you Marxists can convince liberals and conservatives about that occasionally. I totally am for that. I think equality of opportunity is a great idea for any society that considers itself to be civilized. Otherwise, it isn't, right? So, but when it comes to equality of outcome, I agree with Jordan Peterson. Once you start moving towards equality of outcome, you go absurd. What Jordan Peterson doesn't understand, that this is a heritage both in the right and the left. It's called Hitler and Stalin, and it's called Rousseau. And both Hitler and Stalin loved Rousseau and were essentially Gnostics. And these Gnostic fantasies of equality of outcome is a little bit like the 11-year-old Peter Pan who wants to impress his mom, but he couldn't care less about reality and being a grown-up. And that's where these dangerous ideas come from. They all go back to a guy called Mostak, who the Persians dealt with in the Persian Empire. And he inspired both Muhammad and later inspired Stalin and certainly Hitler and tons of other guys. Mostak had the first bright red flag, by the way. And he created a society that looked good on paper when everybody was forced to be equal and married across class divides and everything, and all resources were split and shared by everybody. But it turned out to be a bloody nightmare at the end.
Yeah,
So
I'm not a communist, obviously, but like this
I
expression.
am, but I'm not a socialist. I am a communist.
I know some good communists on the left. But this expression equality of outcome, like that is something somebody like Peterson, like I don't know where this phrase came from, but it's like I've not heard that phrase trafficked on the left as if that's what we're fighting for until Peterson came along and declared, you know, for the left that that's what they're doing. And so
okay, I'll remind you of
like
leftist discourse here. I'll give you a little history lesson. The entire 19th century, at least in Europe and partly in America, was a fight of the left between Marx and Rousseau. Okay, the Rousseauans were the Jacobins ready for the French Revolution. They were obsessed with the quality of outcome. They have these Rousseauan fantasies that we must create a society where everybody's equal resources. Whereas when Marx says to each according to his needs, he literally means that according to the needs of what you're going to work with tomorrow. So he doesn't mean according to needs equally for everybody. He means to each according to his needs. It's a fundamental Marxist idea. And this is the idea that the guys who work the hardest should have more resources than those who don't work the hardest. That is Marx. It's not equality of outcome at all. Marx literally means, and this is what Peterson does not understand with Marx. Marx is the advocate of equality of opportunity more than anybody else in history. That's the strength of Marxism. But if it comes to equality of outcome, it's a very childish, infantile dream.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, this is the idea that a lot of woke people have accepted because they're not Marxists. They don't talk about class analysis. No, they talk about who gets the most attention. And when we talk about who gets the most attention, start counting the minutes on television that somebody gets attention, or counting the minutes somebody gets to talk in an academic hall, and they must be deplatformed if they talk for too long or have talked before or whatever. The second you don't care about what's being said in a room, but you care about who talks, you become a Rousseauian. This is an old Marxist critique that goes back over 200 years. And our anarchism has been torn between these two positions too. So this is an old discussion of the left that we return to.
I get that. I get that it's historical, and that's why I say, like, contemporarily, I don't hear, you know, people pushing for that. Like, we don't have equality of opportunity. That's still what people are fighting for. I wanted to make a quick point about race before I forget, because what occurs to me is that, you know, the root of the problem for the different factions that invoke race is reification, right? So when you know, the right and the left do it, it's when you know, you take this socially constructed concept and make it real, right? And so it happens in the way we talk about it, right? So if a Black Lives Matter person, you know, says sort of Black people and it makes it sound homogenous, they're reifying the concept, and that's a bad thing. And so what I see is, like, the sort of white fragility about this topic is they're hearing people of color, minorities use these terms, and it's being reified. But then, generally speaking, white people are also reifying the concept and saying, like, to racist extents, even, right, to wanting an ethno state, to wanting, like, oh, well, if the Black people are fighting for Black nationalism, we should have white nationalism. But it's a false equivalence, right? Because most Black nationalists are not, in fact, fighting for any type of ethno state. They're Black nationalists because of the historical circumstances that makes them want to fight for actual racial equality, to get rid of the concept of race, right? So when you said you're colorblind, like, I totally get what you mean by that and your approach to that, because you mean you don't reify it. You don't necessarily make judgments about a person based on how they look.
No, I got a Black brother. I grew up
Yeah.
in a multiracial family.
Yeah.
He finds these discussions absurd. He's a professor of microbiology. He's totally heroic, and I love him to bits. And I didn't even know skin color mattered to anybody until I was like 14 years old. Because when we grew up, we didn't care. And I think that should
Right.
be the goal. If that is the goal, then yeah, but it also means that it removes a lot of careering opportunities for people who use race now for all kinds of reasons to make careers on both sides of the fence. And I think the only radical way out of that in Hegelian fashion is just to basically claim colorblindness and then look at the real differences, which are resources and wealth and money and having access to academic institutions that give you advantages in life and things like that. That is class analysis, and I'm totally for class analysis. So I think what Nietzsche's mistake is, and I like Nietzsche a lot, but Nietzsche's mistake is that he turns the Ubermensch into this solitary individual. Like, you know, he has this rebellion thing going on against his Protestant pastor father because he's sort of post-Christian. So post-Christianity is essentially Nietzsche. At least when it's good, it's at least Nietzsche. And Jordan Peterson, when he's at his best, is a Nietzsche. But it always struck me when I was a kid is that why is the Ubermensch alone? I'm social. I played in bands my entire life. I interact with people constantly. I live in a very social society called Sweden. We interact with our neighbors all the time. And we even went so far as to try to make our local communes and the state actually as socialist as you possibly could get. And now we're kind of in a dialectical mode where we start questioning that. But at least, yeah, that's a good attempt. I think human beings are deeply tribal. I think tribe is the only thing that makes sense to people. And as a cosmopolitan and not a nationalist, this is why I debate the nationalist, as a cosmopolitan, I want to argue that the cosmopolitan state is even preferable, but it's going to take an effort for people to love a stranger. And this, of
Mhm.
course, a major topic in the world of philosophy. This is what Simon Critchley and Jacques Derrida and Emmanuel Levinas and these guys dealt with the entire 20th century after 1945. It's like, oh my God, instead of just blowing each other up in racial wars and this shit, can we please, try to talk to the stranger? And I think, though, talking to the stranger must not be some kind of bourgeois posing that I have people who look different from me as neighbors, but rather, can I talk to the stranger and be honest about the fact that I might be privileged when it comes to resources, which is proper class analysis? And that's when you start sharing your resources. Otherwise, why would strangers talk to you? So I'm a cosmopolitan, and this again is where the colorblindness aspect comes into the picture. At least when you leave America, where these issues are incredibly affected, and we know why. We know the history of the United States, and we know it's horrible in many ways. But it's not universal. It's not universally valid. It's not at all. The tragedy here is that American culture is so dominant. So I can go out in Sweden and meet an 18-year-old Somali immigrant kid who thinks he has slave ancestors because he watches too many American hip hop videos. That's tragic. He has his culture removed because certain American culture, including Black American culture, dominates the airwaves, and he's eyeballed so much that he can't even find himself in all of this. That is the real tragedy, I think, today.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very
If
ironic.
anything,
It's very ironic for me that many of the key things I studied in university, a decade ago and continued to research sort of became front and center in the culture war in such strange ways, like this, just quickly to return the point, the demonization of critical race theory, and sort of what you're saying, the dislocation of identity and culture, that we just choose whatever narratives we want to subscribe to. But there has to be some sort of resolution on the other side of the culture war, right? Like, we agree Biden
yes.
sucks, right? But the reason I wanted to resolve conflicts intellectually and build consensus over the past few years is precisely to foreground Bernie over Biden, to push over that tipping point so we could have that conversation. So you could see what a debate between Bernie and Trump looks like, instead of Biden and Trump, and instead of Mike Pence with the fly on his head for 2 minutes, and Kamala Harris. Like, this is the sort of philosophical reality I want to instantiate into the world, where we can immediately kind of meet the IDW on its own terms, for example,
Yeah,
rather
but
than there be a
Brent, you know
lag
what?
time. There's a huge lag
Brent,
time in resolving these
yeah,
things.
but what I love about you is that you're deeply subcultural. So why do you try to win the mainstream? I'm working on an exodology with John Sedekis. We're writing books on how people just
Mhm.
find out that fuck shit, the majority of people don't get it. They have a
Yeah.
slave mentality. They're too conservative. They're more tidinal. They're death
Mhm.
dry people. And we are alive, and we're alive. So
Mhm.
we go somewhere. So, okay, you
Mhm.
used to just go somewhere else and probably kill somebody in the process, but at least you went somewhere else and fulfilled your dream. It's called the Exodus. It was the Exodus out of Egypt, etc. And these days, the exodus, I think, is temporal. So it's more like you leave one age and move into a new age. So digital could be horrible, especially if the Chinese get their way. Digital could be horrible if Silicon Valley gets its way. We need to create a new narrative around digital. So that's what we're working on. What kind of excess would that be? That means I don't work with people who are involved with critical race theory and that kind of shit over here in Europe. I work with hackers, because I think hackers are the heroes of the world today. They're in heroic mode. They don't care about woke culture. They think nothing of it. And they just want to create shared social value by providing as many open source platforms as possible to make technologies available as possible for as many people as possible in a decentralized manner to avoid these tech giants from taking over the world. So they're taking the fight against Facebook and Google and Amazon and these giants today, or in Asia, that would be Tencent and Baidu. And not only the fight against the Chinese Communist Party, the fight against Washington, D.C. So I think Trump versus Biden is a theater. It's
Oh, of course.
ironic. It's not power and law. I think Jeff Bezos already is the president of the United States and half the world. Okay. And I want to fight the tech giants. I don't care about Trump or Biden. I think it's a mistake. And for all Bernie Sanders' attempts at even get to the White House as a sort of minority candidate who had a very devoted following like yourself, and many of my friends in Europe were huge Bernie Sanders fans. I can understand that completely. The guy was fantastic. But why go for the White House when the White House is now ironic and theatrical and no longer the place of power is? Well, we should really try to decentralize Silicon Valley and tech, because that's the future. And I want to see you and other people say, let's make an exodus. We could go to a small country somewhere in the world, like Estonia or some country in Africa, and you go see a fucking government, and you have 500,000 people in a small territory in a city and a harbor or something, and that's all you need these days. Singapore and Dubai work very well, thank you. We can create more Singapores and Dubais for open source people who are hackers. And this is the great thing with Europe. That's why I want to split up the United States. You get smaller countries, and they can compete with each other rather than have the United States. Once you have smaller countries and city-states and things like that, you can have a group of people like you and me, have a subculture, and say, why don't we take over this country and try to implement our idea how to run the world here and make it tech savvy, and in that process, really try to implement equality of opportunity for the population within those borders. And that's why it's sick to have white nation, black nation states in America, but at least I can intellectually listen to those arguments, because they at least want to go somewhere and do something different than the current United States.
Yeah, so I want to attempt to nip in the bud the assumption that is laden in some of what you said, and that I agree with you that doing those things is important, the decentralization, hacking, etc. But this assumption that politics should just be written off, like it can't be saved, it's just theater and doesn't have authentic actors within it. And I say I want to really tackle this is because it's not just you. It's like Andrew Sweeney, has said to me multiple times, like, politics doesn't matter. He says, I'm not interested in politics. And that's his way of like foreclosing the conversation, just shutting it down and saying it doesn't matter.
Brent, power has moved. Yeah, but power has moved.
Hold on. But democracy is obviously like dysfunctional. It's tenuous. However, when you have these organic grassroots social movements trying to break through, there is something authentic there, and there is power in the people.
No, but they will fail because they're going for the wrong thing. Politics is dying the way academia is dying. Power is still the game, right? And power is moving towards what we call sensocracy. It's moving into tech now. It's all about tech from now on. We have sensors everywhere. When people tell you and me that, oh, I went offline today, I turned off my laptop and smartphone and went out in the park with my kids. And we're like, well, really not, because there were sensors in that park and there's satellites in the sky. You're no longer outside of the internet. This is the argument of our book, Synthesis, Creating God in the Internet Age. Whether we like it or not, the world is now completely controlled by technology. We have technology everywhere. And also, thank you. It is a great book. And it's kind of neutral when it comes to you and me in arguments at the moment. It's actually not very political.
That's why I like it.
Yeah,
as a post-theology sort of thing.
Yeah, it's post-theology and metaphysical in many senses. And it discusses what metaphysics is: the void, the world all, multitude, and also the possibility that God could be the name of a world we can't even dream of yet, but that could happen. And To me, technology is therefore also the solution to environmentalism, which means I'm a post-environmentalist. I am now an ecotopian, declared. I also am post-nationalist. I don't believe in democracy for the reason that it's tied to nationhood and nation states. And that's why I'm now instead going for cosmopolitanism. And I believe the world is becoming sensocratic. Okay, we have an alternative towards sensocracy already. It's being implemented. It's the communist Chinese one. You can ask an Uyghur or an Inner Mongolian what that's like, and it's not nice, right? It's like these guys have never heard of Orwell, and it's just, okay. But the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping, who's now officially dictator for life since 2014, are trying to implement this sensocracy where they put a guy at the top, a huge Peter Pan, called Xi Jinping, and everybody has to report to him, and then he's going to run things. And yeah, it seems to work. It has to be taken seriously. It has to be taken philosophically seriously. In the new book, we're going to trace it back to Akhenaten of Egypt and pass all the way through Hitler and Stalin on the way to Xi Jinping, because tyranny seems to work in some cases, at least temporarily. And we have to go for some kind of amoral, not moralistic, but amoral alternative to that. What will be the equivalent of something where plurality is the founding principle and where power sharing is inscribed into the Constitution, so that you can have a sensocracy where you split power from day one so nobody can take charge of things, but you have enough power concentrated so things can be delivered. That's what sensocracy is. I did not speak at Occupy Wall Street because I knew that it would take 3 days for the kids to take an Instagram picture of themselves, and the t-shirts at Occupy Wall Street were sold by the very financiers they were boycotting. It was too naive, right? Many of these sort of hashtag flash mobs that we see so many of today will fail because they're naive. They don't take the issues they address seriously enough. They don't go back and retract before they put a strategy out there. They should all read Lenin, like Slavoj Žižek says, to understand what it actually means to overtake and run a society according to a utopian vision. But I think at the end of the day, the struggle today is sensocracy, because sensocracy is both how we can possibly save the planet. Sensocracy we can use in crypto. And crypto means that with crypto, we can make thousands of strangers friends in a way we've never seen before in history. I have great hopes for these technologies. I found them protopian rather than utopian. I think they can, through these technologies, create a much better world. And it also takes a new enlightenment in us as humans to embrace that. And why I disagree with the Game Bee guys, Jordan Hall, Daniel Schmachtenberger, Jim Roth, these guys, is that they're too much of central urban, central planners. They're back at the sort of Stalinist earth that we have the best vision for the world, so we got to control it. Yeah, you do that with urban planning, and that's about all you should do with it. But it's too much that they have the right idea of other people should live their lives. And then you get back into the same place where you already have a problem with Silicon Valley. You get these Platonist boys who think they have the right idea for how you and I and everybody else should live our lives. And I think at the end of the day, I've been smacked in the face enough times by working class moms when I traveled around the world to not have an opinion on how they should live their lives. All we can talk about is the containers, like nation states, city states, where decisions being made. But when it comes to politics, to vote every 4 years when you actually vote every second.
Yeah.
The question is then, who counts those votes and what do they count for? Is it going to be Facebook or Amazon who decide what our every second votes count for? Or are we going to create some kind of technologies where we can respond to that with open source and decentralized networks and crypto, so we can respond to that? And I think that's where I find great hope in the hackers. Because the hacker sphere is the only place that people already are practicing something that I would suggest to you to call the new left.
Yeah, it seems very exclusive though, and very anti-political. Well, I'm not in the hacker space, but I think most people aren't, and we're not seeing the trickle down benefits of things like Bitcoin or blockchain necessarily, right?
We have trickle down benefits of open source everywhere.
Oh, open source, yeah.
Firefox.
Yeah.
Hey, I mean, Proton. If you're smart today, you leave the Google things and you start using these platforms that are open source, and that's what communism is, Brent. That's what communism is. That's what proletarian
Yeah, if we can
Yeah.
compartmentalize the identity topic and issue, I don't just mean us, I mean broadly speaking, I think the left is still fighting for class issues. A lot of that analysis gets washed over, and it's so tragic that Adolf Reed was prohibited from speaking at the DSA because they called him a class reductionist, right?
Mm.
He's not a class reductionist. Um, I don't
And
know. I
why
don't
would
know if
that be?
you.
Why would that
Yeah,
reduction as a negative ring to it?
yeah.
Why would reducing something to the most important thing be a problem?
Right,
It's like saying,
right.
here's a preacher, he's a God reductionist. Yeah,
Yeah,
he's supposed
yeah,
to talk about God,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But yeah, it's like, yeah, if you want to, hey, if you want to have sex with somebody, you want them to be a
yeah,
sex reductionist in the bedroom, don't you? You don't want them to be all over the place doing 50,000 things. I think
yeah,
class is the one common denominator. I think why it's disturbing people from both left and right today is that they're comfortable with identity politics because identity politics isn't radical enough to change the world. It's just on the surface. It's about who gets seen and who gets heard. That is why Marxists accuse identity politics of being bourgeois. This critique was directed against Chantal Mouffe and Ernesto Laclau already in 1985. When Hart and Negri came out with their book Empire, I was so fucking angry
yeah,
about the popularity of the book. I thought it was crap. And that's why Söderqvist now wrote The Global Empire, a book about technology taking over the world, a response to it. And if you read The Global Empire, Next Empire, you realize, yeah, 100 years from now, nobody's going to read Hart and Negri. They probably read our work because 100 years from now, people realize, yeah, technology did take over the world. And that is where you should have had your focus instead of naively talking
yeah,
about the multitudes crossing
yeah.
borders, kind of a hippie fantasy world, right?
And I do focus on these things too, right? It
Yes, you
forms a
do.
large part of my work in the wrote about metamodernism, philosophy of technology via this guy Borgman, and I worked on a smart cities and artificial intelligence book over most of 2019, and so I get that, and I've always been fascinated by not to fetishize it, but the concept of the singularity, right? And many singularities, right? Ones that have already happened, ones that are yet to happen. So
Yeah,
I
we should
get
say that.
that, but
We should tell everybody that we have had at least
yeah,
5 singularities
yeah,
already. They're
but
called physics, chemistry, biology, and probably subphysics before physics
yeah,
as well. So yeah,
but
let's
the
make that
techno
fair. Yeah.
optimists, I keep running into this wall where they're either apolitical or anti-political, and they don't see how those things dovetail, and that's what's so frustrating because
That's
like,
where you
you're a
should challenge
Marxist, but
me,
then there's other
Brent.
Marxists, yeah, that are
Kick me in the butt. Kick me in the butt and tell me why don't you politicize those hackers that you love so much then in that case? Because
yeah,
I think they're way more political than they think. They're the opposite of middle class college kids who think they're political because they demonstrate in the street and fight with the police or whatever. That to me is fake political activism today, whereas the real political activism is often done by people who don't know how political they are, but they create amazing new decentralized platforms for value sharing. And I love Hong Kong. Like, I love the people in Hong Kong. I think that's real. Yeah, it's typically speaking a bourgeois revolution against a sort of feudal dictatorship. Sure, but that should be done, and Marx embraces that completely. And I think Taiwanese hackers are the coolest people on the planet at the moment, especially when they create VPNs so that people who live in communist China can have access to free information online. And especially find out what's going on in Hong Kong, and that the Hong Kongers do not want to be ruled by Beijing. They want to rule their own affairs, and they want a proper full democracy. That's the stage they're at right now. And I totally embrace that. And I also find that it's in East Asia where they fought for democracy recently, like Taiwan and South Korea. Those are the very countries now to deal with. Can they create an alternative to the communist Chinese sociocracy? Is it possible to create a plural sociocracy? The country that is on fire about this issue right now is India, because they're very proud of their democracy, which, by the way, was not inherited from the British. They have always been democratic. India has always been what the world is becoming. It's always been the multitude. And it always had to deal with so many different cultures that live next to one another. Yeah, the
mhm,
caste system doesn't work any longer. Thank God it's falling apart. But that's why India is now asking itself, now we get rid of the caste system, what are we going to do then to keep the benefits of a multicultural society and still keep it together? It's an enormous challenge for India going forward. But I think the Indian model is better than the American model. It's certainly better than the Russian and the Chinese models. I'm terrified what's going to happen with Russia the day Putin dies. I'm terrified what's going to happen with China if the Three Gorges dam breaks loose and Xi Jinping being killed is not enough. So I think China and Russia are very unstable. I think America is less unstable simply because you got the damn constitution. You still have it's brilliant in the sense that it does force you to share power, at least theatrically do so.
That
But you know,
pesky Second Amendment.
yeah, I know, but you know, it's still power sharing, not power sharing, it's power splitting. That's why it works. Yeah. Okay, I'll get kisses from the guys out here in the kitchen. They're cooking a steak for me or something. I'm not a vegan, but
right. That's another thing I remember about you. I wanted to touch on.
I'm not a vegan. I'm not a pacifist. Yeah, I'm so dislike Jacobins that I don't want to be part of Jacobin culture. It's just like, no veganism. I hunt, right?
Yeah.
I kill the animals and I eat them. I'm Scandinavian. There you go.
I'm not an evangelist, like at least I'm not a very good one, but I think there's benefits to like a manifold kind of like aggregate collective benefits if more people do it, right? Because of the impact on meat cultivation, on the environment, the water usage.
I know
for example,
the arguments.
Case in point. I mean, yeah, and so I guess
we're gonna kill off some moose here, sweetie, with too many of them. You know,
my injunction would be just in a simple sense that if you know the arguments, then come back to the halfway point where you can steel man it, but also be critical of it, rather than just say, oh, vegans are, you know, crazy, right? I think that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that happens with critical theory, and you know, you don't do that with critical theory, but that's what I hate to see.
I have vegans
fake intellectuals
over for dinner at my house all the time. It's popular in Sweden too. I don't have a problem with that. But actually, if you're example, you're an ecotarian, as we call it here. Ecotarian means that you can actually go out in the forest and kill animals when there are too many of them. You're certainly helping the balance of nature. You're not doing climate change or anything because of it. And you then add that to your diet. Well, for a Scandinavian or a Canadian, that actually makes sense because we've got a lot of moose and elk and shit around. So
yeah,
you know, it's just that I don't want to politicize that and go there too much. I'm more interested in when we actually meet today because I think it's good for you to give me a kick in the butt in politicizing the hacker sphere.
Great.
If I gamble as hard as I do on the hacker sphere, and I remind everybody that Telegram and Signal, you can't even use WhatsApp any longer because Facebook bought it. But all guys out there use Signal and Telegram. Why? Because it's encrypted. Why do you use encrypted flows of information? Because we don't want Google and Apple and Amazon to eavesdrop on us, and certainly not the government or the military. That's a human instinct that we want to be free. We want our information between each other within our own tribe to be free and not eavesdropped on. That is just a matter of human integrity and decency. And the fact that these tools, Signal and Telegram, are so incredibly powerful today means that's the future of tech. I want to build it from those very platforms because that's how you make people realize, oh, okay, if it's encrypted, that means I have more freedom. Yes, hello. That is mass distributed. They use Signal and Telegram everywhere I go in India and Kenya, in Hong Kong and anywhere. That's like the first thing you do. Everybody can afford a smartphone these days in any country. That's the first thing people buy. And then they use the smartphone. And what do? They go to Signal to have conversations with their friends and family and with strangers. And when people realize the potential of these technologies, that's on a mass level. Yeah. That's when it gets political from day one. But I think a political enlightenment and a political awareness in the hacker sphere could be a good thing. And you can then turn that around and say, all those guys out there who do deplatforming culture, it's just like, why would you have fewer platforms and kicking people off platforms? Create more platforms. Have more platforms rather than fewer. Why would you censor people when they express their opinion? Yeah, you want to stop child porn. Yeah, it's an old argument. I can understand that. I can understand that if people start killing each other online and order murders, that's deeply problematic. That's why we have civilization and we have police and we have things like that. Sooner or later, we have to meet that requirement too, to keep civilization going. Otherwise, it would be really nasty. And we don't want the anarchy of that. We want an anarchy that we choose. We don't want that kind of anarchy. But at the end of the day, if people spend more energy on creating more platforms for people to speak from, especially if they're minorities, rather than try to deplatform people out of some kind of political correctness perspective, which only means they'll go somewhere else anyway and create the new platforms and yell back at you from there. That's not a create a civilized discourse. If you want people to listen to you, the first thing you do, don't smack them in the face. And deplatforming people is basically smacking them in the face and killing them. It's equivalent to
Yeah,
the guillotine.
I mean, obviously it happens on the left, but I would still argue that it's more initiated and a more extant problem on the right. Like it's a different method. Like they're using sort of volume and reach to speak over people, right? So right-wing pundits who ostensibly came from the left, like Tim Pool, you know, they have huge reach, and they're actively trying to cancel regularly, you know, people like AOC, right? They're not engaging in any sincere way with the content of what AOC is doing. It's just sort of hate.
No, but hey, that's America. It's not it's not Canada or Sweden. We're more civilized there. America is Fox versus CNN. There is no neutral place in America. And it's AOC and it's Tim Pool. And they're shouting in their different channels and they get their followers. And we could give advice to anybody like you and me. If you want to be a smart kid, you listen to both. So the principle that you and I like is what we philosophically speaking call antagony. Antagony is a beautiful word. It's not antagonism, although antagonism follows from it. Antagonia in Greek, or antagony, means that you know you become smart about listening to your opponent. Because otherwise, we know the word for being stupid these days is called echo chamber. Echo chamber is what you end up with online when you just listen to the people who agree with you all the time. Yeah. So Team Pool has many Team Pool fans in a Team Pool echo chamber. And AOC certainly has her fans who turning into an AOC echo chamber. They both get stupid in the process. And we just recommend people listen to both and listen to at least 3 other voices. And please, if you're American, listen to voices from outside of America.
Yeah, but it is a false equivalence, like to say that they're just in different echo chambers. You know, I think
television is dead. Newspapers are dead. Academia is dying. Politics is dying. We're all online now. Yeah, and they're both on YouTube and they're both on all these platforms, and they can create their own platforms. And they have
so the creation of new platforms, like not all of them, but you know, you take one like ThinkSpot or what was the one that was a counterpoint to Patreon, something like it, right? But for, you know, for people like Sargon of Akkad to go and fundraise, like that in its inception is an echo chamber where they can share their quote opinions freely, but those opinions happen to be like highly charged and misinformed. And this is the like one of the key like prompts or junctions of the hyperpolarization and post-truth discourse.
Yeah, but we're not going to get out of there. Hey, yeah, it's temporary. We will naturally, Brent, trust people. They get tired of it. You know, the reason why Donald Trump will probably lose this election is because people are tired of him. People are tired of it. The joke is wearing thin, and they're tired of it. He's overstayed the welcome. Yeah, they wanted a few years for him to sort of screw up Washington, D.C., and he was probably not as bad as they thought. But at the end of the day, people are tired. They're even going for Corona Corpse Biden anyway. That just shows how tired they are of Trump. So I think at the end of the day, I trust people in the sense that, yeah, when the sensation starts to wear thin, they start to look for civilized discussions. That's always happened before in history. It's going to happen this time around. I'm glad you are both charged and fun and strong in your argumentation, and still you go for discourse and you want to go for debates with me and other guys. We probably agree more than you thought we would. We probably disagree on some really important points. I think those are fruitful and creative, and we could work on them forward. I'd love to take up this conversation again in not too long and see where that leads. I would gladly share this conversation on any social media platform I have access to, because I love talking to you, Brent. I think you're fantastic. And I think it's an interesting sort of male to male, but at least transatlantic conversation. We're having it from Canada and Scandinavia. And again, I think
Hmm.
that's important to stress. We're
Hmm.
not sitting here in France and the United States. We're not
Hmm.
sitting in the old power stations at all. We're not part of Washington, D.C. We're not part of Brussels. We're not part of those political establishments. We're not even part of the tech establishments. We're kind of two monks who sit in sort of the outskirts of a sort of tech world where we've just discovered that these laptops and smartphones that you and I took to so easily, and where we're sitting and write our books and the shit now. Oh, everybody moved here the last 6 months because of the coronavirus. And oh, we get audiences to listen to us. Okay. Can we engage with them? Because we love to
Hmm.
engage with people. We take
Yeah.
naturally to that. And I actually think that the 2010s are over. And Corona reminded us of it got some realness back into people's lives, for good or bad. I don't think we're going to go back to bullshit culture. We come out of this. And I mean bullshit culture, both in the sense that people who yell and scream and be sensationalist, but also in bullshit culture in the sense of having people who were quoted into giving presentations and then just stood in front of PowerPoints at big conferences and just said cliches like sustainability 5 times or something.
Yeah.
I think quality is back in a big way. And I think quality tends to come in better packaging, because quality requires they listen to somebody for an hour or more and not just TED Talks. TED
Yeah.
Talks and echo chambers are over. I think that's totally over. And the sensationalism to go with them is also over. And I
Let's
think,
hope so,
yeah,
because
I think
yeah.
antagonist key. I've seen it in Scandinavia already. The biggest phenomenon here on
Hmm.
YouTube is a guy called Navid Modiri. He's an Iranian immigrant kid who grew up in Sweden, and he just invites Nazis and communists on the stage.
Hmm.
And people are just shocked. You never thought you would see this, did you? Well, that's the only sensations you're going to have, because the rest is going to be a civilized conversation between people who get to know each other on a stage. And I think those sort of antagonic discussions are the way forward.
Yeah, I hope that that Trump does lose. I think it's a coin toss in my view. Like, I don't want to make predictions. I think a lot of the number crunching is just, just self-serving. It doesn't actually predict any future. If anything, it influences it in negative ways. But if Trump wins, it's not just that his regime continues, but it really makes it hard to have an intellectual public discourse because
No, I don't think
I
so.
you
I
don't
just
think
think
so?
it, no, because it will move away from politics. It's the American obsession with politics that I'm opposed to. Most people today realize that politics has become a theater, a spectacle of television and newspapers and old media, and the
Yeah,
people who care about
I
all that. When I
I
have
think it's
discussions with
it's
people in
hard to
Sweden,
care. It's really hard to care about politics as sincere social movement because it is indeed fragmented and competing interests. But my vision for politics, and I didn't get the perfect left that I wanted through the Bernie Sanders movement because it wasn't aggressive enough. I think we can also agree on that. If it took more risks, if it just opposed the establishment more, we might have seen a different dynamic unfold. But my point is that it's always hard to engage in politics, and I don't get drawn to these things out of personal interest or my own identity. I try to encourage other people to have a politics of care for other people, right? So you're trying to vote for the policies and the platforms, including tech, that actually enable the most people, enable you know uh, income, employment, well-being, inclusion in society. And so historically, social movements, whether like the French Revolution, they have violent effects in the end. It's like, in the American Revolution, politics is always there as some sort of collective activity that is messy, but that we are obliged to sort of sincerely show up and engage in to try to have the best collective outcomes and tipping points. And
yeah,
so,
I get it. I
you
get
know,
it. But
yeah,
if you want to do Bernie Sanders seriously, say Swedish social democracy, at least it was until 30 years ago, highly successful. That could only be implemented in a smaller country like Sweden. That could not happen in the United States of America because it's an empire.
it is an empire, but
Yeah, and
the
and
broader picture is.
I would look. I would suggest them. Why don't you talk to your friends and see what they come up with? But why don't you take one state in the United States that you think you can take over and go for that one and win it over, and
Yeah.
then declare to leave the United States and set an example. This is what America
Mhm,
could be. We're going to prove it to
mhm,
you. Here it is.
mhm.
I think that's the only way, because people then mimic, and that's exactly why I'm a Nietzschean, but I expect my students to be Marxists. I think today that it's my job as a philosopher to declare an exodus and declare a small elite will get it and they will go off somewhere, you know, at least digitally, and then create the new kind of society, raise kids and everything that they want to do using digitally and be immersed in it. And they can set an example. And that's why I say my students should be Marxists, that they can then go for, can we then create a larger class of people who actually can do the same thing? I think that's how history develops. And I'm Hegel. I think it's the only way forward. But I'd be interested in see when you get a sort of have more platforms, more generous sort of left in North America that sort of skips politics but goes for technology. And that sort of meets the hacker sphere that I work with here in Europe. That could get really interesting. That could get really interesting. And I think just occupy one state in America, declare it, like it could be Oregon or whatever, but declare one state independent from the United States and then implement these sort of leftist policies there and see if it works. Yeah, why not?
Yeah, I mean, well, I want to be sympathetic, but I think fundamentally these sorts of experiments aren't really objective. Like there's always permeable borders and you don't get the effects you want, and it takes time, right? So you run an experiment for
Yeah.
10 years, you know, or UBI experiments. Like I'm for UBI on principle. I kind of think we don't need more experiments to like, hey, let's see if it works. You know, it's more of a value of how an economy can function, especially for somebody like me who's going to attempt to work in any case and just wants to be compensated, not for doing nothing, right? But um I guess the final point we sort of oppose each other on here is like the exodus idea. You know, you want to
Yeah.
escape and foster a new community, and I think that's sort of just escapism on the face of it, that it's sort of, you know, you have the right intention, but it's abandoning it's abandoning the struggle, right? Because you want to go off and create an enclave and prototype it and then say, oh, look at us, it works. But I think, you know, just on the surface, you know, not getting into the politicization of the word socialism, but yeah, we want to point to social democracies like Canada and Sweden that have a more robust welfare state than the United States, and just say, hey, let's go in that direction, while demilitarizing the military industrial complex, because it's a global empire that actually asphyxiates and strangles human development and environmental preservation and whatnot. So, you know, there's got to be a middle
That's
ground.
a good point to end up with a disagreement, an antagony. We haven't got
Mm-hmm,
it right there.
mm-hmm.
I love this conversation, Brent. I got to go off and
Yeah.
eat my steak
Okay.
mousse or whatever. But I love this conversation. I'd love to continue it. I think you're a bright kid. But I think you're great. So let's have this conversation and let's return to it.
Sounds
Share
good. And
perspectives.
just a closing point for myself and for the whoever's listening. What attracted me to you and to the metamodern discourse, you know, on my own before I discovered the other groups working on those things, was the impulse to go beyond critical theory and beyond postmodernism, being versed in those discourses and problematizing them, and wanting to go beyond. But you know, nobody should be throwing the baby out with the bathwater with these complex narratives as they build on each other, right? And so I think that's, you know, one point we can converge back on.
Yeah. And I'm fully with Foucault. I'm a huge Foucauldian and a Marxist. I just disagree strongly with the Laclau move perspective. I don't believe in leftist populism.
Okay.
That's where I stay with Marx and Foucault.
Mm-hmm.
So I did my critical theory. I certainly did so. I love the
Mm-hmm.
Frankfurts. I work with those
Mm-hmm.
guys and their theories all the time. But
Mm-hmm.
we're arriving at slightly different, and I find it very interesting that we so far
Mm-hmm.
arrive at slightly different conclusions. Let's stay in that. They
All
stay in
right.
that mode.
Sounds good. And enjoy your sacrificial meat.
I will. I will. I will think of a veganism when I do it.
Perfect.
Big love,
Thanks.
brother.
Likewise.